at HASTAC, which is a global nonprofit dedicated to learning the future together, that's based here at Duke. I want to thank all the HASTAC team for everything they did to put this on. Mainly, though, I want to thank the 5 amazing people that we're going to be hearing from for the next few hours. This is really 5 scholars whose work has made me hear and see and think about American culture as profoundly as anyone I know. Somebody asked me recently, why theory? What's the point of theory? And during the last couple of months, when we've all been bombarded with lots of information, lots of data, I've been thinking one thing that's so great about theorists, and I would say all 5 of the scholars here today are theorists of everyday culture, and especially everyday racism and everyday homophobia. The great thing about theory is it helps you take the incredible bombardment of data, information, propaganda, prejudice, all of the things that are coming at you, and helps make it into certain kinds of patterns, so that the next time it starts coming at you, you know to duck. That there's something about being able to recognize the pattern before it hits you that I think is one of the things that for me is what's so vital and important about the kinds of theory that we're going to be talking about today. As we were in the midst of planning this conference, something happened that for me exemplified many of the things that Sharon Holland writes about in her brilliant and just searing book, The Erotic Life of Racism. And some of you may remember this from North Carolina. This was in May when we were planning this conference. And it was at the time that Amendment 1, remember Amendment 1 to the Constitution was on the ballot? Amendment 1 reads, marriage between one man and one woman is the only domestic legal union that shall be valid or recognized in the state. And it was right before Amendment 1 passed that Jody Bunstetter, who's the wife of the North Carolina senator who had framed Amendment 1, actually wrote Amendment 1, was asked why he did this. And here's her quote. The reason my husband wrote Amendment 1 was because the Caucasian race is diminishing and we need to reproduce. I don't know if you remember that. What's interesting, there is nothing about race, nothing about race in Amendment 1, and there's everything about race in Amendment 1. And I would say it's that way of hearing and theorizing the world for not what it says, but often for what it doesn't say, or even lies about, that these 5 scholars exemplify for me. It's a great honor to do this panel. There's bios of all of the scholars in your booklet, so I'm not going to read it again, read those through. But I want to thank Sharon Holland for writing a great book that's brought us all together, and thank the other scholars who are visiting for this really remarkable occasion. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jack Halberstam. Then will be Marlon Ross, then Catherine Stockton. Sharon will respond, and then Mark Anthony Neal is going to begin by asking questions among the panelists, and then open it up to all of you. I think we've got a really, really exciting afternoon ahead. Thank you so much for coming. Thanks for this.
So you don't speak at the beginning?
No.
Okay. All right. All right. All right. Thank you so much. Is this projecting, or did you say this was just to? It is projecting. Okay. So thank you all for coming. Thank you to Kathy Davidson for organizing this panel. Thank you to Sharon for an incredibly provocative book. Let me tell you what I'm going to do, and then I'll try to do it in my allotted time because I have a lot. The first half of the paper, I actually want to really engage Sharon's book. It's not just about Sharon's book. I'm trying to engage Sharon's book. There are things that are incredibly provocative to me in the book, and there are things I disagree with. And I actually just want to kind of put that out there and have the conversation. Then in the last piece of the presentation, I want to move to presenting some recent music that I think takes us to a different place in terms of the theme of thinking about blackness in relationship to radical alterity. And hence the title, No Church in the Wild, as you all know, comes from the Watch the Throne, Jay-Z, Kanye collaboration. But I want to actually play a piece by a young black rapper who has created a mixtape of No Church in the Wild, and think about what happens when you remix it. Okay, so that's where we're going to go. And let's just start then by thinking about this binary of black and white. Touch is a big topic in Sharon's book, and the book ends with a searing moment of racialized tactile exchange in Absalom. But the black-white binary that maybe is best known to us, or the representation of it within the art world, comes, of course, from Kara Walker. And that's maybe the place where we have learned to understand the way in which black and white take on meaning precisely in relationship to each other. So I'm going to start with Kara Walker, just to think about the way that Kara Walker's work gives shape to the long and disavowed afterlife of slavery, within which the quotidian, the everyday, and the fantastic nestle right up against each other. So we see, as in this image, figures dance and fly, embrace and flee, but they also shit and fuck. They are penetrated and maimed, they chase and they hide. Walker has said of her work that, quote, she would be happy if visitors would stand in front of my work and feel a little bit ashamed because they have simply believed in the project of modernism. And I really like this idea that shame doesn't simply come from confronting the content of the racial archive that subtends the society that we live in, but in believing in the reparation of that original wound. The shame comes not only from the confrontation that Walker stages, but also from believing that such violence has reached an end and is now a thing of the past, and therefore has no place in the museum and no relation to the patron, him or herself. As Walker's work shows vividly in the US, blackness is always framed by whiteness, and whiteness is permanently stained by its painful and shameful identification against and outside of blackness. Black figuration in Walker's paper sculptures emerges literally from cuts made into the fabric of whiteness, and whiteness is all that remains when blackness has been cut out, literally. So this black and white landscape in which love and hate, the erotic and the aesthetic, appear through, within, and alongside one another is the backdrop to Sharon Holland's brilliant new book, The Erotic Life of Racism. And this is just another image that uses that same pairing of black and white. Glenn Ligon's work, like Kara Walker's, makes the same kind of claim. Now, in The Erotic Life of Racism, which is like, I mean, you have to read it cover to cover, by the way, and I do recommend that you do that. It's a rant, but it's also poetic. It provides deep insight. It speaks from an archive of rage, resistance, and revolt. And basically, in the book, Holland is refusing to move on from the black-white binary as a definitional building block of U.S. culture, and taking the black queer female body as a paradoxical site of disappearance. Holland launches an incisive, at times furious, but always engaged and engaging critique of everyday racism and everyday homophobia. She defines her project as an exploration of, quote, the intimacy upon which everyday racism relies. So the intimacy of all of these different daily encounters within which racism is deeply lodged, while not always appearing to be so. The book builds in its conclusion to a masterful encounter, hence Touch, between Rosa and Clytie and William Faulkner's classic Southern Gothic novel Absalom, an encounter that begins with a black hand on a white arm but ends in violence. Reading the touch exchange between the two women as an intimacy shared by blood strangers and as an erotic moment in the midst of years of unending violence, Holland comments, quote, the intimate moment that Rosa and Clytie share is ordinary. It is quotidian intimacy that forces us to realize the other as someone with whom we interact, have an impact on. Our acknowledgement of this connection represents the touch and its fruition. The touch, in other words, finds a place of possibility, of contact, and also gestures towards the outside of what Hortense Spillers has called this American grammar of race, by which she means a structure within which it is almost inevitable that racism will emerge, because it's already in the structure of interaction and communication, hence grammar. And one of the claims that Sharon makes is that we don't engage enough with Hortense Spillers in order to build our responses to racism, and it's that kind of deep excavating work that needs to happen under the banner of everyday racisms, which I totally agree with. The touch signals another level of communication. So we think about hate as something that emerges in speech, but what if it emerges also in touch, as a sort of haptic sense of communication, one that Joseph Roach would call gestural or kinetic, that others have called haptic, and that undoes through eros what has been cemented in rhetoric or words. But before we arrive at this remarkable conclusion of the erotic life of racism, and the last chapter is really where everything comes to a head, Holland takes her readers on a tour of contemporary theory to reveal the places where blackness, and particularly blackness in queer and female forms, has been excised and erased, sacrificed to the project of universalization and abstraction, casting a theoretical tradition of black feminist thought as the unspoken and uncited and unfootnoted foundation of much contemporary queer and critical theory. Holland examines the psychic life of racism as it continues to play itself out in relationship to a vexed and troubling black-white binary. And there are a series of readings of critical race theory, queer of color critique, post-positivist realism, and intersectionality. And Holland is asking, before we move on quickly from the black-white binary to presumably someplace beyond race, she suggests that this binary is so entrenched that we have to dig back in and engage again with its roots in order to understand how racism continues under the heading of the quotidian. What is she worried about then in terms of people moving on from the black-white binary, which of course has long been a baseline for critical race thinking, that we should move beyond the black-white binary and think about the complexities of the racial state in relationship to the management of multiple sites of race and racism, right? Well, she's worried that, for example, diaspora theorists too quickly leave the ground of nation behind and therefore abandon a project that could be identified with native feminists. She fears that queer of color critique proceeds without a thorough account of the impact of women of color feminism, and that it's too quick, again, to move on from the black-white binary and do justice to it. Ultimately, I'd say that the book concludes with a whisper rather than a scream in its tour de force reading of this racialized touch in Absalom, Absalom. But the first 3 chapters clear space and lay ground for arguments that then take hold in the book's conclusion. Now, at the very heart of the critique that Holland is concerned with is her sense that all philosophical and theoretical references to the abstract and the universal in theory as a whole, but particularly in queer theory, rely upon another black-white binary within which whiteness becomes the atmosphere of universality and generality, and blackness again is assigned to the specific, the local, the particular. And that's why we have to look into the everyday to discern the outlines of racism. So let's take on this theory, this argument, and see how it plays out. And there's just the sort of the black signs of a black feminist critique. Some of the readings of queer theory for me were contradictory at times, but her intention to reposition black feminist theory at the very heart of all attempts to explain and describe everyday racism and everyday homophobia is the one with which I want to join forces. But in order to do so, I think, we have to understand what black feminist theory is beyond simply a citational index of black female academics. There are many versions of black feminist theory, some of which can be found, for example, in hip-hop. And so I want to move us out of the academic a little bit in order to get to the everyday. We also want to engage some of these cultural archives where black feminism is so strongly articulated. So in the next section, I'm going to take issue a little bit with the critiques of queer diaspora and queer of color critique and say I don't think that Sharon's project is necessarily at odds with those projects, and see if we can't link them back together again. So this is part 2 of 3 parts. Now, as so many theorists have shown in the last decade, the first wave of queer theory was, as Marlon Ross puts it, claustrophilic, and I don't need to cite Eve Sedgwick here at Duke for us all to know what he's referring to in terms of the epistemology of the closet. In terms of its emphasis, he meant on the now you see it, now you don't, mechanics of seeing, knowing, and being gay. The emphasis on the closet joined with a deep interest in canonical literature on the one hand and white male bodies on the other. Okay, now more recently, this is just a crash course in queer theory for anyone here who needs it. More recently, queer theory under the influence of Leo Bassani and Lee Edelman has made reproductive futurity the symbolic frame against which queerness comes into view as a negative force of unbeing, undoing, and unbecoming. But then you could read Catherine Brown-Stockton's entire oeuvre, if I might say, as something that counteracts that idea that radical negativity, the futurity that depends upon the child, inevitably leads us back to this formulation of queerness as sterility. And in fact, Catherine Brown-Stockton's work undoes that formulation by thinking through the child to come up with new models of queerness, directionality, and orientation, hence growing sideways, for example. And then in the past few years, you could say that queer theory has increasingly been interested in the transnational and getting out of the framework of the US, which is very much a closet framework, a visual racialized framework, and has been interested in the sexual economies of non-US centric projects. And it's that move away from the US and into a more transnational understanding of queer theory that Sharon Holland is taking exception to, not as a whole, but in relationship to the way that blackness then gets formulated. So let me explain how that works. You could say that Sharon has two surprising targets in the erotic life of racism. First, queer of color critique, and when you're reading the book, you would have expected there to be an alliance with queer of color critique, and the second, queer diaspora. So before offering a critique, let's understand why you might be suspicious of these two strands of thought. Rod Ferguson's work, Aberrations in Black, is the obvious reference for queer of color critique. And as you know, many people have read this work, it takes aim at canonical sociology and suggests that in the very place of social knowledge production is the place where racial ideas, the racial pathologization of certain forms of family is cemented and encapsulated. And this is, hard to reckon with because the very vector that should remediate racial harm becomes a place where it's cemented. And you only have to mention the Monahan report to understand exactly how that works. So he drew attention to this tendency in canonical sociology in order to claim that the project of sociology itself has been tainted by its deep involvement in the discursive production of racism in the US as knowledge. Ferguson shows that 20th century canonical sociology, rather than recognizing the ways that slavery and institutionalized racism that followed slavery had disorganized and decimated the black family, instead sociology produces a set of narratives about blackness that essentially link black people to deviance and read familial disruption as an internal problem to deviant communities and households. As Ferguson puts it, quote, generally, the sexualized perversions of industrialization were scripted onto the racialized meanings of U.S. urban landscapes. Given this kind of mapping and scripting, canonical sociology as a discipline and as a formal mode of knowledge production has relied upon a black-white binary in order to render invisible all the ways in which white communities have benefited from and continue to benefit from what Holland calls the erotic life of racism. So, what's interesting about Sharon's work is that in her first book, Raising the Dead, she, like Ferguson and like Lyndon Barrett in Blackness and Value, tracked exactly the way that whiteness attaches itself to life and to liveliness and to reproduction and continuity and futurity and so on. And therefore the way that within that black-white binary then, death is ascribed to death, inertia, and sterility, right? So Holland wrote in that book, quote, discovering who resides in the nation's imaginary space of death and why we strive to keep such subjects there is the central inquiry of this book. And her book and Rod's book were coming up around the same time, and Lyndon's book, Lyndon Barrett's amazing book, Blackness and Value, that I would send anyone back to who hasn't read it, that takes on Enlightenment philosophy, no less, to exactly show, epistemologically speaking, where blackness got assigned to death, not just presuming that that would be obvious, but reading it into Kant, Hegel, Heidegger. Okay, so given that Holland and Ferguson share this interest in the production of blackness as death, deviance, and disorder, how do we understand her criticism of queer of color critique in the erotic life of racism? So in chapter 3 of this book, titled SHE, which stands for Singular
Historical
Exogamy. Thank you. Yeah. You can see why she abbreviated it.
I want to show that somebody other than you knew it
Yeah.
It's spreading. What's that?
Holland takes aim at queer theoretical uses of women of color feminism, which, according to her, unify. Okay, so this is the critique of certain uses of women of color feminism. That on the one hand, they unify prematurely under one heading a set of complex positions. Okay, that makes total sense. Second, jettison black female queer bodies from the discussion in order to discuss them in their absence, right? And then third, project unfair expectations of critical radicality onto black feminist theory. I think that that's a really clear and compelling critique. But then, and this is where I would make a disagreement, she then makes an odd alliance with the work of Philip Bryan Harper and challenges the project of queer of color critique and of queer diaspora. And I'll tell you why I think this is an odd alliance in a moment. So basically, this is a much needed critique that she launches, an inquiry, but it repudiates alliances that I believe the work actually depends on rather than is in opposition to. So let's start then with the work with which Holland joins forces. For example, this Philip Bryan Harper essay that Holland claims has great usefulness for her own work. The essay in question appeared in Black Queer Studies under the title The Evidence of Felt Intuition, and it builds a theory of minority experience and everyday life, hence the connection to what Sharon's trying to do, around two encounters, personal encounters that Philip Harper has while traveling. The essay clashes almost directly with another essay in the same volume, Black Queer Studies, by Rinaldo Walcott, who is a queer diasporic Black Canadian critic, that contains an impassioned call for a transnational Black queer studies, in which he claims that US-based Black scholars aren't paying enough attention to the kind of work that Black scholars outside of the US are producing and should be in alliance and in conversation with. Harper's essay is sort of the opposite of that. His use of personal anecdote tends to reduce complex questions about passing, national identity, sexual desire, and mobility to narrow micro-discussions about personally being misrecognized at an ATM in a potential cruising scene. One anecdote he tells here about being mistaken for a Sri Lankan could have opened out precisely onto the connection that other diasporic queers are asking for US-based Black scholars to make, but instead he feels misrecognized in the encounter and that his Blackness has been erased. Harper uses his international encounters, many of them about cruising, by the way, encounters in which his racial identity is unreadable to others, to bolster his sense that he should never leave New York City because only there is his Blackness readable. Okay, that's kind of a condensed version, I admit. But nobody is as provincial as a New Yorker in some sense. Okay, let's just remember that New York is the whole world. We don't have to go anywhere because everything is already here. In fact, in the 5 blocks that I live in is good enough for me. There's that sort of sense to the essay that let's not go too far afield because suddenly we're not readable anymore. What's the problem with not being readable if it puts you in an alliance that could be fruitful with diasporic queers of color? Okay, so that's sort of my question there. Holland, however, here's something different in this essay, something that one would want to take very seriously. And in another essay by Harper, called ironically, Take Me Home, Take Me Home to New York City, a critique of the transnational turn in queer studies with which she wants to join forces. She worries that this transnational turn strands African-American queers in a kind of parochialism, an implied parochialism, which I just did, notice, okay, and loses the specificity of the white-black binary that continues to structure everyday racism. She resists the transnational turn and the move to think outside of the national framework through an invocation of diaspora. Holland summarizes, quote, in essence, when queer theory looks outward to remember Harper's caution, it often engages in the particular American practice of forgetting Black, female, queer. If she appears at all, she is reproduced within the confines of a delimiting historical racial practice, one for which we can have no accounting. And I would say to Sharon as well, try looking for Black, female, queer in Philip Bryan Harper's work, which is made up of these erotic connections between men. I don't think that you'll find it there, nor will you find Black female masculinity to any extent in his book, Are We Not Men? Unlike Mark's new book, Looking for Leroy, by the way, which I'll talk about in a moment. Now, in a similar vein, Holland joins forces with other queer scholars in Native studies who take exception to queer diasporic critique Why? Because it pits queer immigrants against queer native peoples. And there's been a lot of discussion about this at the various critical ethnic studies conferences. She says, we are ever reminded of the importance of diaspora as a critical move outward in recent work on queer theory. This, however, leaves a native studies critic like myself wondering what to do with issues of native sovereignty and presence within the tightly construed matrix of US-based versus diasporic critical engagements. So she worries that queer diaspora is being set up against the potentiality of native critiques of sovereignty and nation, which makes sense. Now, the answer to this question, however, what to do with the queer diasporic angle that seems to ignore specifically national formations and a queer of color critique, that seems to forget the specific contributions of black queer women while invoking a generalized notion of women of color, cannot come from a retreat to the personal and local, as in Philip Bryan Harper's work, nor can it come from taking a break from feminism, as in Janet Halley's work. Even less can the answer come from replacing intersectionality with Deleuzean queer assemblages, as Jasbir Puar argues. And Chandan Reddy recently has a critique of this move away from intersectionality that he thinks sacrifices, again, the complexity of US racial formation that I think Sharon Holland is completely in sync with. The answer, then, to Holland's question is inherent to her project. The nation must be unthought and undone by the very black-white binary that composes it. You have to go through it to get around it. I think go over it to get under it, right?
Too high, you can't get over it.
Too low.
You can't get under it.
Thank you.
Next verse, right?
Yes. And so this emphasis on everyday homophobia and everyday racism that she sets out to document, expose, and explore tends to support rather than unravel the black-white binary, and therefore must be countered with theoretically, culturally complex narratives of rebellion, resistance, and refusal that come both in the form of cosmopolitan diasporic black cultural production, but also in the alliances that join people of color to a project that exceeds the imaginary of the racial state. And that imaginary comes in black and white. But speaking then of imaginaries that exceed the racial state, this is where I want to move to something that I'll call black anarchy. And this is my last section, if you're keeping time. Here we are, no church in the wild. Okay? So last section. In refusing to move on from this black-white binary and its place within a racist imaginary, Holland insists on examining the ways in which the erotic runs through rather than around racism. She wants to know about how love and hate course through the same racialized territories, the black touch on a white arm, and the same bodies. But by the end of the book, once she's laid bare the erotic life of racism, Holland finds a lyrical place where black and white are released from their tense opposition and fall into a more porous relation. While blackness and whiteness, as Walker's silhouettes and Glenn Ligon's paintings show, remained locked in oppositional modes of being, Holland concludes ultimately that the separation of white and black is not only impossible, but dangerous. But I want to end today not with visual art that reproduces and plays with the black-white binary, but with a young, queer, native black rapper who understands herself as multiply dispossessed of land, of property, of legitimacy, and who therefore turns to anarchy rather than the state. In this post-election moment, we can maybe all understand that, okay? To anarchy rather than the state for a way out. And there's a long tradition, by the way, of black anarchy. And I can't recommend highly enough Shelley Streby's book that's coming out from, of course, Duke University Press in the spring, called Radical Sensations, in which she re-narrates, rehistoricizes a set of transnational anarchist movements in the US in the first part of the 20th century that joins Lucy Parsons, a black Mexican native anarchist, to Emma Goldman and to the Magon Flores brothers from Mexico in a multinational push to oppose the state, not with new state formations in the form of socialism, but with full-fledged anarchy. And at one point, Lucy Parsons and her white husband, Albert Parsons, were seen as the most, more dangerous than an armed mob by the Chicago police. And Albert Parsons took part in the Haymarket riot and was killed for it. Lucy Parsons and Emma Goldman actually didn't get along, which is kind of interesting, and we'll leave that for another story. But I think that that tradition that Shelley Strebe is remaking for us echoes through recent work, not necessarily in the academy, but in hip-hop, okay? And that's why I'm going there, if you want to know why. So I want to end today by thinking about new expressions of political will, Gaga expressions, I call them in Gaga feminism, as they emerge in a moment of radical uncertainty, a time when shifts in ruling elites do not change basic existing conditions. You can put a new guy in an office or even the same guy in the office, but you still have the same structure in place. And yet, as Lauren Ballant explains in her latest book, we still hold out hope for alternatives through the embrace of cruel optimism. After showing us the form of cruel optimism in our congested present, a fantasy that sustains our attachments to objects and things that are obstacles to getting what we want, Ballant also, at the conclusion of that book, turns to what? Anarchy, by way of conclusion, and argues that anarchists enact repair by recommitting to politics without believing either in good life fantasies or, quote, in the transformative effectiveness of one's actions. And she cites Dave Graeber and Gibson Graham there. Instead, the anarchist does politics. Why then? To be in the political with others, for that reason alone. This includes participating in art projects, communal efforts, cooperation, both of the kind of that anarchist Peter Kropotkin wrote about, and of the variety discussed more recently by Richard Sennett in his book Together. But who are the we of this fantasy of togetherness in this anarchist move at the end? Let's think about the lingering deep problematics of the we, who persist in what Ballant calls an optimism for optimism. Am I in the right place? Yes. Despite the ongoing structures of what Sharon Holland has called the erotic life of racism. So we're going to move on to Angel Hayes, a black native queer performer who, I wonder if that's the next one. I'm not sure. I'm not going to move there yet. Who grew up in Michigan and New York City and by her own count survived a youth spent in a religious cult. And she performs her own songs and mixtape versions of other people's songs with an unusual combination of passion, vulnerability, and raw, unedited rage. She also articulates a black queer feminism and a critique of black masculinist nationalism at the same time, and takes us out of the modern and mannered interactions of urban polite society and into an anarchist space of the wild. Hayes recently chose Jay-Z and Kanye West's brilliant song from Watch the Throne, No Church in the Wild, to freestyle to, and the results are mesmerizing. So we have a number of, I'm just going to show you these verses. Frank Ocean, the queer hip-hop singer, sings the riff. Human beings in a mob, what's a mob to a king to a god, what's a god to a non-believer who don't believe in anything. If that's not an articulation of anarchy, I don't know what is. Okay, so that's Frank Ocean's role. The Jay-Z lyric tells of a structure of power where the hierarchies cease to hold. And this is a kind of great chain of being that passes from God to king to man, that's crumbling in the face of waning religious belief on the one hand, but also a rapidly diminishing faith in the public realm of mainstream politics. So for Jay-Z, the battle is epic. The players are heroic. Existential questions about virtue and value are up for grabs. And for Kanye, when we get to Kanye's lyric, sex and drugs, okay, that wasn't right. Sex and drugs are as good a substitute for God and King as any. The video that accompanies the song is full of sound and fury of the male mob. It's moving, majestic, wild, and utterly patriarchal. Can you turn it up?
There you go.
Yeah. Bring the lights down.
We don't believe in anything. Make it out alive. Alright. Hands on the mausoleum floor. Bloodstains of Coliseum doors. Lies on the lips of the priests. Giving the skies as a feast. Rolling in the Rolls Royce condition. Only the doctors got to somehow control police. No casing, all white like I got the whole thing bleached. Drug dealer chic. I'm wondering if the love spreads reach. It's pious, Carlos pious. Socrates act too pious for y'all seek. Off Plato, switch. I'm out here balling, I know you hear my sneaks. Jesus was a carpenter, Yeezy, play beats. Overflow the Holy Ghost, make the hell about your seats. Preach. You know what I mean?
Okay. And by the way, this film is shot by the same guy who makes the MIA videos and is supposed to refer to the London riots and the riots in the banlieue in Paris in 2005. It's staged in a kind of Fight Club setting, totally devoid of women. And while it is also a cosmopolitan hip-hop masculinity of the kind that Mark Anthony Neal has written about so eloquently in his epic study Looking for Leroy, this is still a world without women, radical, sexy, powerful, precisely because it is all male. So what happens when Angel Hayes goes gaga on this song and takes her understanding of freedom to a whole other level? And this is my conclusion. She begins by building on the hook at the beginning. Human beings in a mob. What's a mob to a king? What's a king to a god? What's a god to a non-believer who don't believe in anything? But Angel Hayes immediately drops the great chain of being analysis altogether and heads straight for the critique of the masculinism of the whole. What's a king to a god? That's the only piece she takes. What's a king to a god? And moves straight onto what are humans to the king of the sky, this pride that I'm wearing and these things on my mind. Further on into the song, where Kanye begins to rap about sexual freedom, Angel Hayes makes freedom a battle of the people against politicians, a battle of realness against representation, language against feelings, and she builds her own theoretical climax. Is nothing really real, huh? They ain't got shit that you can feel, because none of it is tangible. No church in the wild.
See, this world is been designed for the guppies and niggas in high power. Really the biggest puppets, and know that I don't believe in the curses of generation. Just know that the fucking past is only intimidation. Just know that it's a reminder that only enters your greatness. And know that the fucking devil is in the form of these haters who are in the form of these pages. And know that your fucking speech is the biggest form of betrayal. And since life is merely a conversation, pay attention to the words and the lyrics that they be saying. Pay attention to them saying the realest is what they claiming. And look behind all their words and see what they are displaying. It's nothing really real, huh? They ain't got shit that you can feel, huh? Cause none of it is tangible, no church in the wild, we governed by fucking animals. Hello, Mr. Obama, comma Mrs. Obama, comma future elections, hello Hillary Bottom, tell me what are the stakes, I'm pulling by to the plate, you can kill some, steal some, what the fuck does it take? And tell them you're just a face difference in the choices they making, and tell them they don't make changes, only bigger mistakes, and tell them I said fuck them, these are bunches of nothing, then that I'm fucking free, and all of the shortcomings who put the guns in the palms of the ghetto, introduce the color kids to the songs of the ghetto, who made it just a medal for the seeds of the souls of the slaves of the past that they ain't let go. I talk to God, but I swear it's so different cause the pain's so loud. I can bet he won't miss it, but the rain slowed down. I regained my whole vision in the blood from the pain and the grace go missing. I need a sign just one time. They don't want you when you real, don't accept your kind, but the struggle leads to greatness. Life is not just a given, the shit is just what you make it at.
In the hands of Angel Hayes, an anarchist anthem is unleashed from a song about masculine revolt. There is no church in the wild because the hierarchies that hold black and white, male and female, queer and straight in place have fallen, and power finds new sources and new soul and new expression. I'm pretty sure that Sharon Holland, like Frank Ocean, Rod Ferguson, Hortense Spillers, Kanye, Fred Moten, Mark Anthony Neal, Lucy Parsons, and a whole host of other black, queer, radical feminists would sign on to this riveting conclusion where we learn that struggle leads to greatness, life is not just a given, this shit is what you make it. Thank you.